Forgiveness is not something that everyone can afford. Yet, we expect everyone to forgive their sinners. Even the fact that they are victims are ignored because we expect them to forgive every single time something bad happens to them. The way that this narrative manifests in this world today is that it is unconditional and absolute. It is something that is expected rather than something that is exceptional. Then what do we prefer from opening government? What we prefer is forgiveness be something that is rather conditional. That is something that can be a privilege rather than something that is accepted. Rather than something that is an exception than a general norm. And why do we believe as such? I'll start with the issue from a micro level as to how it impacts the individual, and then I'll talk about the macro political instances of it. When it comes to individuals and the way that they're wronged and so on and so forth, if there is a narrative that suggests that forgiveness is a virtue, that you are expected to forgive someone who has wronged you, then if you as an individual are not someone who is imposing, if you do not have a strong personality, then you are rather expected to go through those social norms. You are rather expected to forgive, oftentimes right away, rather than understanding the impact that it has on your individual self. Because if you look at actions that hurt you, whether it be abuse, whether it be something that in a relationship that hurt you, or whether it be a bad parent-child relationship, oftentimes they do not impact you at the very instance. It's something that you feel later going on. But however, instantly, oftentimes you are expected to forgive that individual. Even because that individual is somewhat sad about it. We understand that that individual might be apologetic of it. But you're still expected to forgive them. Now, why is this bad? Because you strip away the agency of that individual to process it properly and oftentimes give an outburst of anger that was necessary at that very moment. Because you're essentially living a lie. You never really intended to forgive that person, but you forgave them anyways. Because your religion told you to forgive that person. Because your society told you that parents aren't people that you can not forgive, but you always have to forgive. At that point in time, that person and that person's behavior oftentimes either change tokenistically for a small period of time or do not change for a longer period of time and keeps impacting you again and again. But even if it does change fully, that the scar of that memory itself impacts you for so long that it builds up within you. The fact that you did not have an outburst of anger builds up within you, and oftentimes it outbursts on other people, which is to say that because you've been wrong and because you feel that something wrong has happened to you and you couldn't express it through anger, that becomes something that is a burden on other individuals. Why do we think anger is something that happens in that world? Because the opposite of forgiveness is oftentimes the anger, lashing out. The fact that you did not like what that individual did. What do we rather suggest? This individual can be angry as much as possible. Because if you look at anger itself, anger is a very natural response to anything and everything that can happen to you. Yet, we condemn anger to the extent to which we believe that anger is something that is so very bad, and rather a softer approach to any wrong that has been done to you is something that is always a virtue. The point at which you do not allow that anger to be expressed is the point at which it builds up and impacts your mental health to a large extent. Moving on to the macro political impacts of this particular issue. We think at different points in history, believing that forgiveness is a virtue has dynamically made sure that we did not change radically instances of history that were essentially wrong. I understand that we glorify what happened in post-apartheid South Africa, but if you look today, then you'll see the massive inequality of blacks and whites in South Africa is a result of the fact that during that time, someone called Nelson Mandela believed that forgiveness is a virtue. We think that because of peace and justice, we want there to be forgiveness. But then we fail to take those radical steps that were probably necessary. At that point in time, we failed to understand that radical redistribution was the solution to past injustices. Whether it be things like reparations, are never even considered a solution because forgiveness is expected. Because there is a collective action that went on in that particular case, and you did not think that any form of radical change, any form of solution through anger would be possible. Whether it be the civil rights movement, where we held whites to the standard to which we don't expect anything from them, but rather the bare minimum. The bare minimum is something that you deserve anyways, but the bare minimum is something that is seen as a virtue for them. Forgiveness is something that is expected of the oppressed community so bad that the oppressed community never seeks for anything as a political solution, even when they have the political bargaining chip. This is where a lot of people, this word, not only apartheid South Africa, but in a lot of instances, we miss the opportunity to radically change society, and given that this is a retrospective regrets motion, we think that it is incredibly bad, and envisioning a world that was channeled through anger, that demanded justice of oppressors would have been much better. Before I move on, yeah.
Why would anger allow me to build a better community with policies which people follow?
Because anger essentially redresses the things as they are rather than sugarcoating them as we've seen in history so far. Lastly, we think for the longest amount of time, religious organizations have been getting away with so many things because they have sold the idea that forgiveness is a virtue. The worst aspect of it is the fact that on a micro level, you're expected to forgive your bishop for abusing your child. Why? Because forgiveness is considered a virtue in the Bible, and you're expected to forgive your religious spokesperson. But on a macro scale, you're always expected to forgive the Catholic Church, regardless of the fact that they've hid instances of child abuse for so very long. Again, why? Because forgiveness is a virtue that has been established in religious books and been sold to you, specifically the Christians who would have changed the Catholic Church for so very long. And you do not hold them to any standard whatsoever because this narrative has been weaponized against you. When you allow religious organizations to weaponize such a narrative, this is not just religious organizations, but any other institutional capacity, you let them get away with crimes that are systemic and collective. Because you cannot pinpoint who committed this crime, but rather it was something that the system committed upon you. You allow institutions to get away with it because they are the ones who own that narrative. Which means the Catholic Church gets to get away with this. And in a world where forgiveness wasn't a virtue, in a world where you are allowed to express your anger, you do not allow them to get away with this. Lastly, I know they're going to talk about rehabilitation of crime. What we want to say in this particular case is that rehabilitation of crime can also happen in our world, where the criminals rather feel guilt rather than assuming forgiveness as something that is a given. If you can channel guilt in the proper way and work yourself to become a better person, we would rather have conditions imposed on rehabilitation rather than having the very, very liberal idea of, oh, crime is just a manifestation of society's problems and individuals do not need to feel guilt. Individuals feeling guilt is essentially a good thing in this case. We're incredibly proud to do this.
I think this debate was created for all things to discuss the idea of forgiveness as a virtuous norm within society. The burden on opposition bent is to not defend the oppressive ways religious cults or religious churches operate, but to discuss how forgiveness as a societal concept and as a normative form of narrative is taught in society and why its presence is crucial and why its presence should or should not go away. Understand, the concept of virtues, which OG should have discussed, but we'll do their job further. Virtues are preached from an early age and taught to people to be aspirational and taught to people as values you should ascribe to, you should aspire to always meet. These are things like charity, these are things like forgiveness, these are things like love thy neighbor, which are societal constructs you build yourself with. Why do you think people decide to build in these constructs in the world in the first place? Because, in case you didn't know, all of us are pretty terrible human beings by default. Which is why we need to codify ourselves to be decent fucking human beings. And even then we struggle to do it sometimes. That is the scale of the problem. We think, in a world where you steep the scale and remove virtues that teach you to be positive and teach you to be good away, you are left with your innate instincts. These innate instincts look like rage. These innate instincts look like hurting others. These innate instincts look like otherizing someone else. And these innate things look like fighting someone, whether it's verbally or physically. Think of yourself as a child who did not know anything. And let's be honest with yourself. How did you deal with your first friend in school who was dark-skinned? Did you deal with it well? If you look inside and ask yourself, you probably did not. When you were taught to be better, when you were taught to forgive yourself and forgive others and be more empathetic, you probably dealt with that better. And we improved as we grew up and up. But the problem is, People know that we have these horrible innate things within us and they tap into it. This tapping in has not occurred anywhere, anytime more than ever than in today's 2019 toxic political and societal landscape, where media and demagogues tap into these innate things to create a truly toxic landscape where rage is en vogue and your ability to forgive and love others is not. This is why today's political rallies are filled with hate. This is why today's political rallies are filled with the nation's greatest leaders mocking disabilities, mocking races, and doing your best to belittle and hurt and demonize others. This manifestation then trickles down onto everyday microtransactions and people continue to suffer. Which is why more important than ever for this narrative to exist. Because what is a narrative? The narrative is a continuous dissemination of a message to show that it is a norm. Exactly more than ever, you have to understand that your world of anger only accounts for good anger, where poor people rise up against a bad person. But it doesn't account for anger as a norm. Anger as a norm looks like these hateful things not just existing in rallies, but each and every field, school, classroom, and living room across the world. You have nothing in your case that deals with anger as a normalized thing. In fact, you create a world where anger is thought to be an aspirational value because your biggest politicians, your biggest military commanders, and your biggest macho men in society promote anger and promote hurtful actions. That is why it's extremely important for forgiveness to exist as a virtue and for that narrative to be disseminated. Because this is the narrative that preaches empathy, that preaches forgiveness, that preaches relating yourself with others around you to understand that even if they look different or even if they've been hurt in some way, there are still things you can find in common and there are still ways to work with them. We think this is very crucial. You have to address why taking away this narrative won't unleash a plethora of other harms and how those account in macro and micro level. You did not do so in your speech. We think forgiveness for the collective and the individual is actually a good thing. And we completely will engage with Sourodip's idea that this will only act as tokenism things. We'll also deal with this ridiculous idea that pent-up violence and pent-up anger is not better in his time. How so? Understand, what are the benefits we get from forgiveness as a virtue? Firstly, forgiveness is not useless, and it's offensive for him to portray it as such. We think forgiveness is really good, and actually a good tool for protest, far better than violence. What do you think creates, let's look at it. What does a violent protest look like? A violent protest looks like throwing milkshake in the faces of Brexit politicians. It looks like Antifa. Have these created a landscape where you moderate and come to discussion? Because like it or not, the other conservative side and the other Anglo will always be there. What you need is a tool that lets you sit on the table and create a table for transaction. We think forgiveness is the route to creating a table for transaction. Why? Because in a world where you can demand for an apology, when you can demand for forgiveness, you have the ability to create an initial demand. Your step one is to not throw a milkshake or to not push someone or not to call them back with a name, but ask them to respect how you've been belittled and acknowledge that. The ask for this acknowledgement is also known as call-out culture, which has allowed us to take down sexists, rapists, oppressors, and oppressive mechanisms in everyday things, from high school locker room politics to mainstream politics as well. We think the ability to create this table for transaction, the first time someone says, "I'm sorry for my actions," it validates how you were hurt. It validates that your trauma was real. But most importantly, it takes and puts lenses of scrutiny onto all of these people who apologize to you. It makes them admit that something they did was wrong. But the next time they try to hurt you again, even if this forgiveness was tokenistic, as Sourodip says, the next time they try to do something to you, more people are watching, more people are listening. So the next time a sorry won't cut it. The next time you have to say, you cannot come back and debate at another tournament, or you cannot come back into this school, or you cannot run for this particular office, because you've proven yourself to be unable to forgive and unable to move on. We think it's very important to uphold this virtue because that facilitates better discussions of transaction. And it allows us to make better demands. As an individual, we think it's far better dealt with if you have the ability to forgive others. Why? Because in a world where your anger is pent up within you for ages, that creates a world where you're mentally not proper. That creates a world where you're lashing out at others because of something that is happening to you. How true is that? All of us have struggled to find outlets of our rage. All of us have struggled to forgive our bullies. And in turn, we've probably bullied someone else. Or in turn, we've been rude to our maid, or rude to our mother, or flippant with someone in an everyday interaction. And that interaction, if it felt good for us, it hurt someone else. But in a world where we forgive, even if that person hasn't realized, I as an individual individual knew I let something go. You take away the ability for people to be the bigger person. And we think that's a terrible thing to do to people. Because if someone doesn't want to learn, at least I should have the ability to forget that person and feel good. Forgiveness allows me to do that. How do you facilitate individual change is something you never address. When we think of political systems, when we think of individual lifestyle, political systems the changes in political system, yes, can be facilitated through violence. But violence cannot be step one. Because the root for that violence needs to lead to long-term systematic change. The table happens when it's a discussion, and forgiveness is a significant part of forming that table. Stripping and breaking away the legs of the table don't create a platform for discussion. It creates a platform for saying black people burned Baltimore. It creates a platform for liberals through milkshake at me, and they don't want things to change. That does not facilitate change. For individuals and for collectives, let people forgive and let people love and move on.
So, am I audible? Yeah, this works. Ready? That was a lot of liberal white apologism, and I will dismantle it both philosophically and analytically during my speech. First, forgiveness versus the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue. Here's what forgiveness is. It's first-hand and internal, intensely personal understanding of the hurt inflicted on you, understanding your recovery from those wounds, your mental condition to move on, your assessment of both the remorse and the changed behavior of the person who hurt you, and it's an endorsement of that changed behavior. That is what forgiveness is. And it's nothing like the narrative of the forgiveness being a virtue. Forgiveness is not the end of the chapter. Some days you feel like you've moved on. Some days you think you haven't moved on. It still hurts. You still hate your abuser. It winds down over time. It's intensely natural to what you are, and it's completely internal. It comes from within you, how you feel that day, how much it hurts that day. The narrative of forgiveness that they want to push, being a virtue, is nothing like that. It's external, it's societal, universal, continuous. It's toxic as hell. It's an imposition because it judges the victim for holding on to their anger and their hurt. It makes them less worthy of being considered good people in the eyes of society. Because they haven't forgiven. How can they be really good if they chose not to forgive? What kind of conscious choices it is to not move on, to get bitter, stay over your hurts? Those are the kind of judgments this narrative automatically imposes on these individuals, on the victims. It's the worst form of victim blaming. And it's considered to be the end of the chapter. Once you forgive, you can never bring it up again. You've already forgiven them. How can you keep harassing somebody about this? That is the toxic aspect of the forgiveness narrative. It is horrible. And guess what? It's the most marginalized groups that are expected of forgiveness. It's the battered housewife expected to get over it. It's the Native Americans who had their land and their lifestyle stolen, who have seen their grandparents, heard stories of grandparents getting killed, that are expected to forgive and move on because now it's one America. We all have to build it together. It's the blacks and in South Africa who have been born a crime and things like that. They're the ones expected to forgive the white apartheid people and move on like Nelson Mandela told them to ensure they brought up. It's all because we as a society are afraid of processing anger and yet surprised when that anger explodes after reaching a tipping point. So all those Baltimore burning things, none of that would have happened if you actually listened to these black voices when they spoke out in anger instead of expecting them to forgive their abusers all along the way. That was horrible. Forgiveness, in my mind and ours, as Shaurdip said, is a privilege. It's one that needs to be earned. If if you're the abuser, if you're the rapist or molester, etc., you need to seek forgiveness of the people you hurt. Make it up to them. It's not supposed to be easy. And this is how it engages Fardeen directly. Forgiveness cannot be expected before this point. People's lives could have been changed entirely if they were not expected that the approach of this forgiveness or apologizing should be met with forgiveness. Not only the individual lives, history could have been changed at many points. At the Emancipation Proclamation after slavery was ended, after Native American reparations, at the end of the apartheid, most importantly, the departure of European colonial powers from the colonies they left, where France had not been expected, Algerians would have not been expected to forgive France at the point that France left. If we had not been expected to forgive and be okay with the British when they left, our relationship would not start from a position of lower down, but actual, understanding of the hurt that had been committed. There wouldn't be as much room for both apologism and denial. Denial which is spread all across Europe, thinking that the empire was good, the empire built railways, the empire brought you missionary schools. That kind of white supremacist thinking that Fardeen apologizes for would not be there. I think anger is good. Sourodip explains why anger is good. I'm going to explain further. In your world, anger only exists as the domain of macho men. That's because throughout history, the legitimate anger of marginalized groups, of battered women, of the LGBTQ, of the minorities who have been silenced, have continuously been expected to be suppressed and expected to be silent. So the macho man's anger, the white man's anger, takes up entirely the full narrative and media portrays it as such. And if forgiveness is a virtue, if we are all expected to suppress our anger from here on in, that is 100% of all anger that exists. We bring out the voices of the angry women, of the angry gays, of the angry trans, etc., and angry minorities, of the angry chakmas. And all of this does great work. We think Antifa does great work because it has shown right-wingers that the violence that they have always practiced is not going to be met with complete silence and with subservience. We will be violent as a response to your violence, and a world where we are allowed to be violent as well as them is much better than a world where only they are allowed to be violent and we are expected to be quiet and to bow down and take that pain and take that sort of suffering and complete disparity without being angry about it. Understand the philosophical genesis of forgiveness is extremely flimsy. Forgiveness came from all of those monotheistic religions, etc., that automatically assumes all of you are sinners, and as a result of which need to be forgiving in order to get some sort of salvation, etc. And that has been spread across society, primarily to the interest of these religious institutions who want their actions, not only their narrative to be the dominant philosophy, but also their actions to be above review, and even if reviewed, to be forgiven. So in all of those ways, we're not asking opposition to defend child molesters within the church. We're asking you to recognize that the philosophical origins of this forgiveness thing came from some extremely shady and self-interested institutions that wanted to operate with impunity. Understand that forgiveness is internal. Forgiveness as a narrative is an external imposition. But more importantly, it's a narrative that none of marginalized people had any sort of hand in shaping. Nobody asked the battered housewife if forgiveness was a virtue when crafting that narrative. It was always the people who themselves committed abuse that came up with that narrative and then imposed it across the rest of society, all the battered housewives, etc. These are the individuals who get hurt the most. Everybody gets hurt. Everybody has some room to forgive someone. But it's the ones who are abused the most. The marginalized, the vulnerable, the ones who have nothing. Their voice was not taken into account when shaping this narrative. Which is what makes this narrative extremely toxic, because nobody really judges the white man who refuses to forgive, or their anger is very frequently shown as being somewhat justified, especially if there is some level of justification for it. But the burden of forgiveness frequently falls on those who have been hurt the most, and very frequently they have been hurt so badly that they have no platform to express their point of view of why their anger is legitimate. You take the most silenced people and you tell them their anger is illegitimate, and they have no avenue to answer you back. Those are the reasons why the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue is super toxic. We stand up for those of us who have never been allowed to stand up for themselves. Very proud to be opening government on this.
was working. Okay, so I've seen this a lot of times in these debates, and I hope this time the judges don't let OG get away with something really terrible. Look, what they're doing is, they're telling us that these people will be angry, and then they're assuming that some mechanism is going to come out of it. There's been no analysis on what this mechanism looks like, on what this anger looks like to the white majority, and whether that anger can win against the white majority anger that they themselves characterize. Without this, without me even rebutting anything in their speech, they lose this debate. But secondly, I think they try to cop out by characterizing their kind of fear as the optimum good, where only black people will exert fear, anger, and white people won't. While they characterize forgiveness as something that will only affect black people. Second, they tell you that forgiveness is a certain degree of some things, but the norm for forgiveness is somehow different because of its origins. I think this is bullshit. I don't care where this norm comes from. It's irrelevant to this debate. What's relevant is what this norm looks like, and all of the things Aaquib characterizes at the beginning of this debate is what this norm looks like. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness in status quo looks like a call-out, where someone has to apologize to that call-out. What does this call-out then represent? This apology needs to be accepted on a condition that these people don't repeat these call-outs. Fardeen talked about this extensively when he told you that when churches do something bad, we ask them to apologize, and they say sorry, and essentially this means that they're now put into a lens, and we check if they did the things that show that they've repented, for which we're going to accept their forgiveness for. This is a part of this debate they conveniently ignore. They tell you that people need to seek forgiveness. We tell you without this being a virtue, there's no reason for the church to seek forgiveness, because it's not a virtue. You don't want to do that to begin with. But second, let's understand something. Norms have limitations. What are the limitations of this norm? A, the norm says that it's virtuous to forgive, not that you should always forgive. No one is expecting you to be fucking Mother Teresa. That's not the expectation here. They're asking you to be virtuous to a certain degree, but not to the point where you have to literally give up everything. That's why their argument doesn't work, and that's why our norm of forgiveness is much more measured, and it's a characterization that allows these individuals to call out and still accept certain degrees, and not accept things like genocide. Let's face it, we have to talk about a narrative that exists in status quo, and the narrative that exists in status quo doesn't accept genocide, doesn't accept rape, doesn't say that these things should be forgiven. That's not the narrative that exists right now, and that is the narrative they have to speak out against. They can't bring up an imaginary narrative that doesn't exist and then bash that. They don't win that debate by doing this. But secondly, the norm also allows you to take back forgiveness at a later date. I think we've seen a lot of instances where individuals have forgive their abusers when they've done horrible things, but they've spoken out into the longer run. That happened in presence of this norm. The difference is these individuals didn't resort to anger at the very beginning. If a person who was assaulted by resorted to anger at that very beginning without being composed, without being sure about what she wanted out of this, should have been laughed at, should not have been able to phrase her concerns in a proper way, should have been called as a person who wanted to besmirch this person, good man's name. The reason that it got certain degrees of acceptance is because she got that space to think, which only happened because of this norm. Because Fardeen already told you that our human basic knee-jerk reaction is anger and action. Sometimes that action isn't things that you're going to be very good at doing things. Secondly, they talk about marginalized communities. Well, here's the thing. Marginalized communities are far worse in trying to decipher what's the right degree of action, especially in anger. Which is to say, a white man in anger might still be able to figure out what's the degree of thing that they do. Because sure, they're used to oppression, they're used to doing these things, right? But for marginalized groups where their anger is defined by pain, and this pain is inexplicable, I think that it's highly likely that they aren't exactly sure how far to take that. Which is to say, this can create large chunks of harms on them in the longer run. But second, what is this part of this debate? By the way, timer, can you give me a minute count? What is this part of this debate that they've ignored, right? What they've ignored is this part of the debate that says that there is an individual level of forgiveness that we want to speak about as well. What does this look like? It looks like you being able to forgive and feel better in a therapist's room. Let's recognize something. You know how like most of the times when you've been wronged by certain things, your psychologist will often tell you that you need to forgive and let yourself grow and let yourself breathe. Why is this true? Because if you don't do this, your pent-up rage and anger that exists in your mind is going to consume you. Because oftentimes when you have been wronged, you don't have the ability to do something about it. You're often weak. You're often that bullied person in school. If you speak out right now against your popular bully, no one's going to believe you. You're going to lose the very few friends you had, and this bully is going to bully them to not be friends with you anymore. At that time, not being able to forgive means that you're going to be stuck into that toxic loop. Now what's going to happen in their world is some people who are rich enough to afford psychologists will be able to get this good advice. However, for the vast majority, when their knee-jerk reaction is anger and no one tells them to do otherwise, they don't have that opportunity. Which is to say, they're going to live very tortured lives, and I can say that in certain instances, this probably leads to the horrible mass shootings you see in certain instances, because a lot of these times, these people are bullied, misunderstood, and so on. Which is to say, this is going to be really, really bad for them. Again, can you please tell me what time this is?
Are you suggesting that the anger of minorities is either invalid or unstrategic?
I'm sorry, what? I'm saying the anger of minorities at a time of duress, at the time that harm has happened, there are many things that could go wrong there, right? I don't have to say minorities are horrible people. Please don't try to frame that on me. But understand that you can't really say that most of the time this will lead to good results, and you've never done that. But secondly, let's talk about anger as a response in minorities to begin with. Aaquib wants the trans person to be angry and lash out at the majority, right? Therefore, validating literally the only thing that we are probably seen as angry people who don't understand things and just lash out entirely, right? I think when it comes to a competition of anger, white anger will always win over black anger because of a few reasons. The first reason is they've been very good at using this anger for a long time, right? The second reason is they almost always control the way perceptions happen because they're probably in more positions of power. Which is to say, most of the times when these angry voices clash, there's no way out for that minority individual where they're constantly demonized as people who've done horrible things and who are basically not doing the most constructive thing out there. What happens when the norm of forgiveness exists? When the norm of forgiveness exists, there's a step-by-step mechanism to change. What does this look like? Let's recognize, if I'm to call out right now a group of individuals who've done something terrible and I don't want forgiveness for them, what essentially happens, right? For them to acquiesce to my demands, they have to do the restructuring that they want to do right now. Because there is no stepping stone, there is no layer of forgiveness that happens in between. Because I'm not asking for forgiveness to begin with, because the virtue isn't there, and I'm not seeking for forgiveness. The problem is, there is no way you're going to get that. In a negotiation table, if you start from that position, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get anywhere. The way you approach these issues and move on is at first you get forgiveness. And with the forgiveness, there's some level of checks and balances. With that checks and balances, the next time this thing happens, that forgiveness has to come with something else. Which is to say, in the long run, this tends to be something that gives them proper change. Once again, what's the time for this? When do I stop then?
When you're done.
Okay, this is weird. Alright, so, right, finally, I think we need to get something very clear. We're here to defend the norm of anger. We're here to defend, 1 minute left, okay, fine, we're going to do this. We're here to defend the norm of forgiveness. We don't have to defend the toxic ways this narrative has been shaped in very minute places in very minute societies. Which is to say, most of the times when we debate in an optimum situation in a functioning democracy when it comes to democratic things. Which is the same rules probably should apply here. I think we need to defend the norm of forgiveness as a whole as it extends to most individuals. If certain parts of South Asia is toxic and has that norm to going to the extent that you can't question your parents to any degree whatsoever, I don't think that's something we have to defend because that's not what the broad narrative of forgiveness looks like. That's a bastardized version that we shouldn't have to defend. At the end of this day, why do we take this debate from OG and from pretty much every other house in this debate? Because we've showed you how violence becomes their go-to action and this violence never ends up being something good. They've never responded to anything like this, and we've also talked about how forgiveness creates the chance for individuals to be introspective in the face of them having a way out. Which is to say, when it comes to a white person who has to respond to something, if he's asked to ask for forgiveness, he at least has a space to breathe in and be introspective and say that, okay, this is what I've done wrong. If he's attacked directly, I don't think that same thing exists, which is why we should win this debate.
Can you pause and check? Very briefly.
35 minutes through the whole debate. So that's what. From start to now.
Yeah, we started recording, so it's fine. It's some 7-ish minutes. We started recording like 4 minutes in, so it's fine.
Is anyone timing now?
Warning to the audience, please be careful. There's going to be a lot of screaming, so hold your ears.
Hello. Okay, I think this is fine. You know, there's an ongoing joke in the circuit that every time we beat Aaquib Bhai, it's when he misses all the mechanisms needed for the amazing impacts he runs. And Kazi is correct, which is why the first thing I'll do is co-opt everything OG said and put the necessary structural mechanisms to prove the kinds of things they've proven. Secondly, I'll give you a completely new extension and show why that's probably the most important extension, something OG missed. Third, I'll talk about necessary kinds of structural changes that are possible in the real world through this. Before that, just to engage OO, I think the biggest idea that OO says is victims find it easier to move on. First, I'm unclear why one narrative makes you perpetually move on for your entirety of your life and the impact that this narrative has. Secondly, I'm unsure why alternatives don't exist, which don't involve forgiveness. So you can go to a counselor, reconcile the event. You can talk to your friends, reconcile the event. I'm unsure why forgiveness is a necessary step in all of those things. Third, I'm unsure why feelings are the most important justification or metric to judge this debate. There was literally no justification. If you can prove that we have a better world, presumably that's more important. Also, this is premised on literally no future bullying. Case in point, if we can also show that persistence of harms exists, not a relevant argument. Couple of things. First, I think OG assumes narratives generally apply to those in minorities. Three reasons structurally why. First, necessity to follow norms based on the degree of power to shape norms and reject norms. United States of America had one terrorist attack. They literally went into Iraq and blew it up. This is because they have the ability and the power to shape what that norms means in the United Nations and have the ability to reject at power at any point in time. Bangladesh was forced to apologize to Pakistan because there was no political power to reject the impositions of India or Pakistan. Second, structural reasons. Utilitarian calculus applies to minorities the most, which means it is often them that need to always look at what are the next possible course of benefit rather than the course of harm. Majorities can often incur utilitarian harms because they have privilege and wealth to back themselves on. Utilitarian calculus on micro-level decisions don't apply to majorities. Third, moral proof. You always have to fight a burden where you have to prove that you're just as worthy a citizen within the country or just as good a nation, where Hamas has continuously got to be moral, but IDF doesn't. The reason is such because minorities have an existential bias against them that they have to continuously provide moral proof against. These are the structural reasons why narratives are likely to apply to minorities. Second, structural reasons why forgiveness is associated with forgetting, something that like OG assumed. Number one, for you to forgive someone, you have to dilute the image of that suffering in your head, which means you have to reduce the impact because the viscerality of it is something you can never reconcile. Something that requires dilution is something you're more likely to resort to forgetting rather than simply forgetting. Second, you also want this to not affect you in your future life, so all potential triggers means you have to reconcile it in a way in which doesn't affect you in the future. If it is a part of your memory, you could possibly get triggered by it and therefore not have this virtue on you. Therefore, you're more likely to force yourself to forget the entire event altogether. I think we've already beaten OG by now. Here's where we do some really cool stuff. First, why do we think this literally removes moral evolution of humanity? I think this argument is important. I'll say this now. Because the reason why OO says we need to forgive is for morality to be forward thinking. Think about the future, the benefits of the future, forget about the past. If we can prove to you that morality is distorted in such a way that future evolution of humans individually are worsened, the moral evolution necessary for humanity to exist is probably more important than the feelings people feel because we'll have a more moral world within this. Why is this the case? I think this requires the premise of forgetting rather than forgiveness. Recognize at a point in time when these victims have to forget the event, they always have to never reconcile what that event meant to their head. So if they had an abusive parent, they literally try to forget that they had an abusive parent, not what abusive parenting means or the moral impact of that on a general spectrum. Because they never reconcile that event in their head, they try to forget it as quickly as possible. This applies from one side. If you think about the other side as well, there was no moral questioning done to that person who perpetrated the action because forgiveness is easy
seek and you see it as morally necessary to forgive. This means on a two-way spectrum, there is no moral reconditioning or reconciliation of what events mean to my life. And anything that is of negative moral consequence to my life is something that I have to discard and forget. So all individuals literally have to have no memories or moral discussions either internally or externally about what events mean. Imagine this on a macro level. Every individual in the world has to not reconcile events, not evolve their personality, not evolve their humanity to the one thing that determines morality, experiences. You literally don't have any version of experiential evolution of morality. You have to resort to other alternatives like textbooks or whatever your dad says is the right form of morality or religion. Why are all of these things important when the current existential experience of morality is something you have to remove? This is particularly harmful because one, this applies to every individual in the world. Second, it applies based on future evolution. And third, it makes sure that literally the world becomes less moral to live in. Kazi.
In the present world, we have some people who've been forgiven in the past, but now we're asking for reparations. This is the current world which you have to define under this motion. How is any of what you said true?
What? Okay, sure, we'll ask for reparations by not forgiving. Sounds like a great idea. I'm unsure what this means. What are the impacts of this? Couple of things that I'll also talk about. When you don't have moral evolution, the definition of morality is restricted on a macro scale, where justifications for incidences have to have new definitions. This is a lot of English words, but in simple terms, when black people get screwed, black people have already forgiven Americans for slavery. So they cannot say, I feel like a slave now, because that definition of morality has already passed them. They reconciled what that meant, they provided definitions and collectively agreed what that means. This is uniquely different to wanting things or policies like reparation. This is important for even if I don't have reparations, necessary discourse where I have to come up with new reasons and new forms of justification. Even though the experiential harm is literally the same, I literally still feel like a slave. I literally still feel unsafe walking the streets of Detroit. There is no moral definition of this that should have new justifications, and unfairly punishing people removes the structural evolution of morality within states as well, because discussions on those definitions are removed. What this means is, even if there is moral evolution, it is through unfair new justifications that are redundant and existential harms persist. CO needs to respond to why. One, the mechanisms we outlined are untrue. Second, this moral evolution is not the most important thing in this way. Very glad to this.
In extension, one of the big things that we see in terms of how you essentially assess a situation after whether you forgive or you not. Secondly, how exactly we think, because this is a retrospective motion, the world would have turned out and how macro level decisions are made that are like significantly more nuanced than in how this actually makes things a lot worse off in a world where you did not forgive. Like firstly, like dealing with OG. Their premise is quite like convoluted in the sense that for some reason society will treat this as every other norm. But the thing is, the opposite of every other norm, for example, honesty is dishonesty, or kindness is unkindness. That is usually directly resulting in morally reprehensible actions on someone else. The specific thing with forgiveness is that the opposition or the alternative to forgiveness would be you feeling pain, would be you feeling a degree
degree of victimization because you are a person who has suffered. On the face of it, we think society has the minimal ability to recognize that this person themselves is a victim in the first place. If you move out of the one society which only victim blames, OG's majority premise no longer exists. And we think largely society has moved on from the point where this happens. We see this because people in general are more conducive to things like justice, where we see a constant increase in the general public rising up in protest and rising up in social justice and going against wrongdoing. But moreover, it is very easy to relate to those kinds of harms for individuals because they are so relevant to their everyday life. We think therefore for a lot of reasons, the type of conflict that society they claim will arise the point at which you do not forgive someone is not so high. So for someone who must not go through the process of forgiveness, has that option on our side, uniquely proven in CO. First thing in extension, this is what I deal with Sajid's very wishy-washy case. The first thing to note is their setup is inherently contradictory to their second argument. If you really believe that these narratives apply so selectively, I really don't think that the ultimate impact is that large in shaping the morality of society. If it is uniquely harming a niche set of minorities, I really don't think you set up the entire evolution of morality premised on that very basis. First thing in response. Second thing, I think like their idea that you never develop unless you forgive is stupid. Everyone is not a victim of some kind of abuse. There are presumably other values society has as well. Presumably we understand why someone's life is just more meaningful because of a few new additions. We think that is as simple as the other virtues in society allowing moral development, not just limited to you forgiving someone or not forgiving someone and then realizing what is right and what is wrong. That in itself is a very marginal argument, but it is also incorrect. Why do we think this is the case? This will move into extension. The first thing to know, when you are betrayed, when you are hurt or cheated in some manner, when you feel the pain that someone else has hurt you, the initial response to this is when you want to hold a grudge or you have a continuous lack of peace. In that situation, the important thing to note is that the process to reach forgiveness is not that you just forgive all of a sudden. We think there is a one to it. The way you recognize this and the way this virtue works is you try to seek out ways in which you would forgive someone else, which is why you talk to someone in the first place. This is not an alternative that Sajid says. This happens because you realize you have to forgive. If you realize forgiveness was not important, it was not an option at the first place to go on and seek help. Why is that? Because at that point in time, you are going through certain degrees of hardship. This is the only thing that OO said, and that's why it's bad for you. We think about the nature and nuance here is that at this point you have been detrimented in certain ways. You want to get back at someone. If you look at the map, you have been harmed in certain ways. Your life has gone from neutral to -2. But what you want at that point in time is disproportionate. So what you want is +2 or +3 or a number you can never even understand. The immediate reaction to this is therefore you are likely to make long-term decisions in terms of hurting someone to a large extent, permanently severing relationships. So the immediate outcome is extremely harmful in your own life in the first place. No thank you. But second of all, you lose sight of the fact that if you made peace with this person, you could go back to 0. Objectively, your life is a lot better at that point than a position where you are continuously hurt. We think that is the one you ought to reach out to in the first place. This is impossible on their side because once you have been hurt, you can never recover what has been hurt. It is in the past. Therefore, you view it as something that is absolutely disproportionate. But we think that the future is something that can benefit you more, which is why Sajid's claim that the past is something you ought to hold on to is absolutely shambolic because that is in itself incorrect in the way your life is actually affected. The conclusion of all of this is hurt and the ability to treat anger is something you can never meet a bar of. Therefore, every decision you take forthcoming is going to be detrimental. Second extension, no thank you. We think that the world in itself has been created as it is because of forgiveness. Because in a world that has been so arbitrarily delivering resources to certain other individuals, inevitably there will be a lot of conflict between people, and that has happened. We think that the reason why forgiveness here was important was because people were able to find ways to not continuously hold grudges. This is evident in the fact that under status quo, while previously any conflict was met head-on with further military conflict and reinvigoration of violence, while now the almost immediate go-to solution is trying to only go into war in defense or to protect yourself. The first response in conflict is a peace talk or a ceasefire. We think the nature by which the world has turned is only because you have learned to forgive in circumstances where it was necessary. In case of such large-scale and macro-level conflict, the only way in which the world could meaningfully actually move on was through this means. Firstly. The second thing on a macro scale with respect to things like reparations and making social change. Why does OJ's model not work? Because they never showed you why, even if you have anger, you do not have the ability to use that anger. Why was this extremely important? Because oftentimes in those situations, what you lose out is the ability to form those relationships or at least make those trade-offs which would make it work in the first place. For example, if we as Bangladesh would have to some extent been more forgiving towards Pakistan, perhaps we could develop more as a region, perhaps some ports and distribution routes that would have helped our economy could have been better off. We think that was a short-term trade-off. But second of all, we think this absolutely eliminates the scope for reparations. Why this? Because often these large-scale conflicts are a timeline problem, which means historically the USA has gone on and committed large amounts of atrocities. But in the immediacy, nothing could have been achieved. If you hold on to your anger, all you do is you go ahead and continue that conflict for a longer period of time to more people, more uninvolved individuals, more bystanders. We think at that point there are two responses. One, you are antagonizing other individuals. Therefore, in the worst case, there is a scope for reigniting conflict with them, therefore further detriment of your own resources. But secondly, you can never acquire reparations anymore because these individuals simply don't see you as someone they hurt because they don't relate to the stories which would have existed on our side, which still remain because it is not that a war is vanishing because you simply forgave someone. Those things still exist on our side. But you forgive. Those people who needed that forgiveness are the ones who can come to your help, and that is the best amount of help we can get in terms of these ones.
Last speaker of the debate. Yes.
there were a lot of Orwellian characterizations from all the other houses, all the other teams in this debate. For example, Popo comes up and Popo tells us that it is all about conditional apology, as in someone will have to say, I'm sorry, I'm willing to offer something, and then you will be able to forgive. We didn't necessarily go with that route, and we necessarily showed how you can still forgive someone if the other person is not willing to offer something, or if the other party is not willing to say that they are sorry. But more importantly, CG comes up and CG tells us that when you say, I forgive you, because it has become the norm in the society, your pain is diluted and people think that your pain is diluted. That is not true. Because understand, in this debate, you have to reasonably assume, when you say, I forgive you, that would mean in your heart, in your mind, you have come to terms with it, and that is exactly when you forgive that person. It's not that you just go and you say, I forgive you, because society is forcing you to say that you forgive someone, because that is not the natural instinct to begin with, right? And even if people think that your pain is diluted, how does it matter? We don't necessarily understand, because clearly it has no impact in this debate, and people generally, they don't even care about your pain to begin with or for a longer period of time. And if your entire experiences and memories of events in your lifetime, they get lost, how that affects this debate and how that leaves someone worse off, that is not also clear. But furthermore, they come up and they tell you that these norms are particularly for minorities. That is not true as well, because Komal is something the elites learned, is something that the minorities learned as well. It's something people in all countries, all religions, all societies learn, and that is how it has been perpetuated as a norm. We tell you, in the current existing world order, something that the entire government bench, OG and CG, they come up and they tell you there were apartheid, there were inequality, there were retaliation to minority communities, and how poor communities, they have to say sorry. We tell you they have to say sorry actually not because they have to forgive. They have to forgive not because forgiveness is a virtue, because they structurally cannot retaliate. Because when they can, they show retaliation. For example, Bahini, when they got hold of the Pakistani soldiers, they actually killed them and brutalized them. When you get hold of the Biharis, you actually torch their homes during the Ashura or Moharram. So you do all these things. But the problem is, more often, these minority communities, they have less resources, they have less leadership, they want this immediate action, but they don't have enough resources, financial or other resources. And there are other groups, other people, other countries who can take advantage of it. And this is how there is a perpetual circle of violence. There is a perpetual circle of violence in Africa, there is a perpetual circle of violence in Sri Lanka, in the Arab regions. And there is no way out. The way out for this is the peace treaties. As Wasif brilliantly pointed out, the peace treaties, the ceasefires, they actually help these countries, they actually help these worlds to move forward. And this is a response to Sajid as well. In higher, forgiveness does not mean forgiveness like individual to individual forgiveness, right? Because understand, when Japan forgave the countries who bombed them, they could actually stop militarizing and they could actually open their borders and they could actually went for free market, which actually helped them. But when Bangladesh acts like an individual human being and not as a state, what it does, it severs ties with Pakistan, which harms them, A, because it does not have a distribution port for R&D industries, it does not help them because they do not have SAARC regional cooperation, they cannot work together in security issues. So when you don't forgive, so what happens is you continue this perpetual cycle of violence, and in the long run, you lose out more and more, and even more, you are less likely to achieve something through this because you are holding on to anger and you are not forgiving. Yes, Sajid.
Okay, so all of your analysis is dependent on this narrative applying equally to everyone. I give you 3 structural reasons why it doesn't.
You cannot give me 3 structural reasons here.
I did in my speech.
Yeah, because what we told you, that these norms apply to every person. You cannot come up and you cannot tell me that there was a terrorist attack and there was a war and those two are analogous. We have clearly shown you why there are structural reasons these countries or these minority communities cannot retaliate within themselves, but if they could, they can actually. They have shown, for example, Kazi and the attacks on Bihari. But if they continue doing this, or if there are more countries, like if Japan did not forgive US, so we would be in a more perpetual state of violence. For example, Iran, Arab, and Sri Lanka. But furthermore, we have shown you that when they come up and when they talk about this was the macro response to the entire government bench, how it is not true and how forgiveness is a virtue helps them. But furthermore, in the micro response, we tell you that we never told that the opposite of forgiveness is clear anarchy. We told you that forgiveness is something which is not natural. Your natural instinct is you are one down, so you have considered one score and you want to get one up, and you don't really know how up you want to get. So you keep going up and up and up, and you have this urge for retaliation. So at this point in time, your natural instinct is to act on your self-interest, and you have cognitive dissonance when you have to forgive someone. This is exactly why you have to establish forgiveness as a virtue. Because understand, people, if you see something, if you can gain through dishonesty, if you can gain through being unkind, you do that because that is in your self-interest. This is exactly why virtues come in and have to establish those virtues so that you act on it. Similarly, when forgiveness comes in, it actually helps you to go against that self-interest. It actually helps you to go against that animal primitive instinct. And that is exactly why this forgiveness helps you to come to terms and peace with it. It is not society is forcing you, like the entire offense says, that society is forcing you to say, I am sorry. It is you coming to terms with it. You might have gone through an entire prolonged period of pain and anger, but you can still forgive, or you can choose not to forgive, and you can choose to hold on it. So even in macro scenario or even in micro scenario, you lose out when you do not forgive, or the perpetual cycle of violence and the perpetual cycle of being unhappy and not being bad continues. But we tell you that forgiveness gives you this cohesion because nothing in the past really changed, right? So when you come to terms with it, you understand that there's nothing that you could actually do that will help you feel significantly better. If you do, society understands it. This is something Wasif said. Because society understands there is a sense of justice to it. Because you were wrong first. But even if you forgive, that's a better thing for the entire societal cohesion and the societal peace. And that is exactly why we think that forgiveness should be promoted as a virtue. Very proud.
Thank all the teams for the debate. Cross the floor, shake hands.